your glory. Amen. Children are dismissed to Children's Church at this time. In 1860, three businessmen founded a fast mail service between St. Joseph, Missouri and Sacramento, California. They named their new enterprise the Pony Express. They made the crazy promise to customers that they could deliver mail out west in only 10 days. They used the 1860 presidential election as a national platform for their diligence and the promises they could make. On November 7th, 1860, relay riders and fresh horses were readied, and the first Pony Express rider left the Nebraska Territory. 7 days and 17 hours later, the rider delivered to California newspapers the news that Abraham Lincoln had been elected president. This got the Pony Express rolling, and soon after this feat, the Pony Express employed 120 riders and several hundred others who cared for 400 horses. It required an incredible display of man and horsepower to ensure that the mail could be delivered so speedily. Each rider typically rode 175 miles a day. When I first read that doesn't sound very far, but then imagine doing that on a horse, I can't imagine. And changed his horse every 10 miles at Pony Express relay stations. The riders were required to weigh no more than 140 pounds. They never stopped to eat or drink. One Pony Express advertisement openly described the danger of taking their job. The ad read, quote, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18 years of age, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily." Who would want to sign up for that? Due to the inherent danger, the Pony Express paid their riders $25 a week, $24 a week more than most unskilled laborers received at the time. The young men who were hired, they were given the horses they would need to accomplish their jobs. They were given a pistol, and they were given a Bible. At that time, to be a rider in the Pony Express was to be engaged in one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. You had to have tremendous toughness and endurance to ride so strenuously for so long, while also outrunning bandits and Indians. One rider became famous for finishing his course after being shot in the jaw with an arrow, which knocked out 3 teeth. He survived to become a folk legend. However, the most famous rider was a 15-year-old rider named Bill Cody, better known to us throughout history as Buffalo Bill. One story goes when Cody discovered that his relief rider had been killed on the journey, he took his companion's mail pouch in hand and traveled over one of the most dangerous sections of the entire trail, 322 miles nonstop, riding 21 different horses. He held the record for the longest, I believe he still does, holds the record for the longest ride through the state of Wyoming. The Pony Express didn't last forever, however. The invention of the telegraph and installation of lines from one state to another ended the need for such rigorous travel. And in 2006, the United States Postal Service adopted the Pony Express's logo, and they still use it today. However, the U.S. Pony Express was not the original. The ancient Persians, which we're going through and reading a little bit, a brief snippet of that history in the book of Esther, they developed the concept first. The Greek historian Herodotus informs us the Persian Empire was connected by postal stations every 14 miles. They had an amazing postal service. He would describe it as, quote, "Nothing travels as fast as these Persian messengers. The entire plan is a Persian invention. Along the whole trail there are men stationed with horses, and they will not be hindered from accomplishing at their best speed the distance which they have to travel." In fact, further descriptions of this Persian mail service gives us the motto, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these valiant couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." The American Pony Express was only for the upper class and business people. Each package, if you complain about postal prices now, back then in 1860, each package delivered by the Pony Express cost $5 per half ounce. That's a lot of money. So only the really wealthy, only business people would do it. And so the Persian government relied heavily on this system, and so it was different for them. The rich, the poor, everyone used this to communicate to an empire that stretched from modern-day Pakistan all the way to North Africa. They had it set up to get information as quickly as possible. This is the mailing system that Haman, in the first part of Esther, that's how he delivers the edict to the entire empire. Every Jew in the Persian Empire would have seen or read this edict. Whether they were wealthy, whether they were poor, everyone would have done it. The news traveling swiftly on the back of horses delivered unfathomable depths of fear, despair, and grief. I mean, the Jews are vastly outnumbered. This edict basically forbids them from even doing anything to defend themselves. But suddenly, the tables are turned. Esther risks her life to get the king's attention, and within an amazing 24-hour window, the threat of Haman's edict is revealed, and Haman hangs from his own gallows. Now, most of us, especially if you grew up in Sunday school hearing the story, right there is where the story stops. We're not given anything else. We can assume that Esther's work is done. She can kick back, relax, enjoy life in the palace. However, there's a reason why there's several more chapters in Esther's story. It's not done yet. This edict is very much alive, even though the person that wrote it is dead and been punished for treason and treachery. The edict is still very much alive. The edict, signed with the king's royal insignia, is now a law. There's nothing that can be done to change it. And so Esther's work is needed now more than ever. God's providence is working now more than ever. And so let's pick up the story in Esther chapter 8 to find out where God leads Esther and his people next. Esther chapter 8, verses 1 through 2. On that day, again, after Haman was hanged on the gallows, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the first place that God's providence leads Esther and Mordecai is to a place of promotion. Historians inform us that in the time of the Persian Empire, treason and felony resulted in forfeiture of property, wealth to the crown. That included not only any houses the person owned, it included any and all property, any and all bank accounts. So King Ahasuerus, if you remember, when he asked Esther, "What do you want? Even to the half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you." Essentially, he ends up giving her half his kingdom, but under very different circumstances than he ever would have thought. Queen Esther turns right around and hands this newly bestowed estate to Mordecai. She acknowledges, hey, not only am I a Jew, Mordecai's my cousin. He's my adopted father. He raised me. So the king now has the full picture. And then you notice in verse 2, the king took off his signet ring. He took it back from Haman, gives it to Mordecai. So not only did Mordecai receive Haman's estate and wealth, he also takes Haman's position. Now these two Jewish cousins occupy the two most powerful positions aside from King Ahasuerus. The buck stops with him. He's the big dog. The next two most powerful positions are now occupied by Jewish people. The queen and the prime minister are both Jewish. And this is all God's providence at work. From our human perspective, it may look like coincidence, but it is nothing less than God's sovereignty. The Creator himself is the only one who could have choreographed this scene to bring it all together. Again, in a span of 24 hours, Mordecai has gone from being honored, being remembered by the king, to having a death verdict where he's going to die a gruesome death, to then being saved, to then being the second person in charge over the kingdom of Persia. However, there is a serious issue that remains. Mordecai's life is saved for the moment, but Esther and Mordecai realize they're not safe yet. And so God's providence leads them next to a place of passion. Verses 3 through 4. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, who wrote to destroy the Jews who were in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people, or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? So Mordecai has been installed. The next thing Esther does is her and Mordecai together, they go and ask for the king to grant one more request. At this point in the story, we would think Esther and Mordecai, they defeated Haman. They win. Let's go and celebrate their victory for a week or two. They realize that it's still dangerous. There's something, their work's not done yet. And so Queen Esther risked once more the king's displeasure by asking him to grant another request. Verse 5 is, please do whatever you can to revoke this law so my people won't die. You can hear the passion in her voice as she pleads for the life of her and her people. However, the king is not really concerned. Notice verse 7, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. Basically, essentially, all right, okay, so I executed Haman. You've got his property. You've got his wealth. What else do you need? There's really nothing else for me to do. I signed the edict. It's got my stamp on it. It's Persian law. It's got to stand. But you know what? He continues in his response in verse 8. He's like, I'll do this for you, though. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king. Seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Basically, I can't change this other one, but you know what? This is what I'll do. You and Mordecai write a new edict, one that the wording sounds good to you. It accomplishes what you want to accomplish. And you know what? I'll sign that one too. Ahasuerus finds a loophole. History tells us that the Persian rulers prided themselves on their infallibility. That's the reason why that a law of the Medes and Persians could never be revoked. If you had to revoke a law, what would that say about your decision making? You made a mistake. You were wrong. If you think you're infallible and you're like a little g God, there's only so much you can do. And so he's true to his character and what he's learned growing up. Hey, I'm off the hook. I don't have to admit that I made a mistake. I'm not going to do that anyway. And you know what? So what I can do is I can get myself off the hook. At the same time, I can please my wife, the queen. I can please my new right-hand man, the prime minister. And that way I am good, and no one notices what a Nimrod of a decision I made. And so he also does something critically important for the Jews as well. God's providence uses Ahasuerus' arrogance and his blind pride into thinking that he's infallible to not only help Esther and Mordecai, God also uses that same arrogance and that same disregard for decision making. God uses that to do something critically important for his people. The next place that he leads is a place of permission. Notice the king's word in verse 8. We just read moments ago. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king. Seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. To each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language. and also to the Jews in their script and their language. So the king's not going to admit, as we pointed out before, that his first edict was wrong and ill-advised. And so he spins it in a way to limit further embarrassment the first edict may cause to him in the future. And the king plays it smooth here, allows Esther and Mordecai to save their people's lives. But the king is also more concerned with saving face. And we see that Mordecai drafts a new edict, has it copied in every language of the empire. Every province is going to receive a copy. It's going to be clear, this new edict, on what the Jews can do. And so notice verse 10, he wrote in the name of the king and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. This edict gives the Jews several legal rights. First, they're able to defend themselves. They can do the exact same thing that some Persians had been plotting to do to them, waiting for that 13th day of Adar. The Jews can have the legal right again to defend. Now they can do something. Even more than that, if you notice, they're given the legal right to plunder any Persian who dies in his or her attempt to kill the Jews. They can do the exact same thing that the Persians can do. And Mordecai quotes Haman's legal edict word for word. Destroy, kill, annihilate, plunder their goods. And so everything the Persians can do, the Jews can now also do. And so Mordecai counterbalances everything in Haman's edict. And so the edict is signed, it's sealed, it's committed for delivery. Verse 14, the couriers mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Now the news is making its way from Susa all the way to the Sudan. And 2 months earlier, the Pony Express delivered an edict of death throughout the empire. I can just picture after that day, the sound of the mail being delivered probably sent a chill of dread down Jewish spines. Perhaps they feared what the palace might do next. Now another letter arrives at the post office, has the king's seal. Someone finally musters the courage to open it and read it. Can you see the joy and excitement on their face now as they announce, Mom, Dad, honey, come here, see what the king has written now. There would be an exciting bustling in the streets. Jewish men and women gather around a set of words that give them a bright ray of hope. Their first taste of hope in over 2 months. The edict gives them the chance to not have certain death. This edict also communicates to the Persians that, look, if you restrain your greed and hatred, no one gets hurt, no one dies, no one loses anything. The edict also gives them a warning, hey, you're not coming up against unarmed people anymore. It's not going to be a buffet of plundering. You're now going to be risking your life and your fortune because the Jews can do the exact same thing to you that you would like to do to them. The Persians now are presented with a choice. They are presented with a choice to restrain themselves and their bitterness, their hatred, their frustration, their greed, and live. Or they can fight and take the chance that, you know what, it might not end very well for me if I fight. And so it's simply a brilliant counterbalance to an unchangeable edict, a complete turn of events. I mean, 2 months prior, life had screeched to a halt. The brakes had been pumped hard. Imagine the dread waiting for that 13th day of Adar. Sometimes, even when we know something bad is going to happen, anticipating it might be even worse than the event itself. And so they're anticipating this day. You know what it's going to mean for your family, your friends, and you know that you're powerless to stop it. The prime minister, the second most powerful person in the entire empire, the entire world, has commanded your friends, neighbors, and co-workers to wipe you off the face of the earth and then claim your possessions and wealth for themselves. Just imagine walking through the city square, going to McDaniel's and picking up the groceries. The tension would be thick. Suspicion constantly mounting. I mean, no one dared make eye contact with you in that situation. No one sympathized with you because they didn't want government reprisal themselves later. The posts on social media, Facebook and Twitter, must have been crazy. You know, you can't trust them. After all, they're not even really Persians. I knew they were a threat to the government all along. Man, they have some nice houses and cars anyway. This was a prelude to another Holocaust. I mean, this was Germany and Poland over 80 years ago. Then out of the blue, a letter comes straight from the office of the king. As you read it, you are equal parts shocked and joyous. The new prime minister is a Jew. His name's Mordecai. The rumors that Haman had him executed were false. Mordecai is alive and well. And as you read further, you discover, hey, the king is on our side. He's going to give us the opportunity to fight and defend ourselves. Even his government officials are siding with this second edict. It's a reason to celebrate. Look at verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white with a great golden crown and robe of fine linen and purple, in the city of Susa, shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. There's every reason to celebrate. Verse 17 tells us that many of the citizens of Persia aligned themselves in solidarity alongside the Jews. Clearly, because it's like, hey, something else has changed here. I don't want to get destroyed. God is already working in his providence to give the fear of the Jews to the people. But I would also say, agree with some commentators, that verse also means that many Persians began following God as well, following in the steps of Gentiles like Rahab and Ruth. Even in God's providence here, he's worked it out in such a way where he's going to receive glory. Everything is going to work out better than any other human could have ever planned for it to go. And then also God still, in his grace, draws people to himself because of it. Verse 16, literally everything is filled with hope. Everything is filled with gladness. Everything is filled with honor. That is quite the reversal from darkness to light. And this is a national celebration. Everywhere the mail couriers went, there was celebration that followed after they left and went on to their next stop. Think of the reversal there. I mean, once seen as the messenger of darkness, the Persian Pony Express is now the messenger of light, the messenger of life. One last place God's providence leads them is to a place of protection. In the midst of this celebration, the storm clouds haven't completely passed. The sky is still gray. The day of the massacre approaches. The Jews are incredibly outnumbered. Napoleon once remarked in war that God is always on the side of the largest army. If that's true, if Napoleon is right, then the Jews don't stand a chance. They are incredibly outnumbered. And second edict or not, death is going to be imminent for some of them, not all. If they fight, they have the opportunity to defend themselves, but that means both parties are putting their life at risk. Notice how the first couple of verses of chapter 9 opens. In the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same month, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemy of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. That word translated hope. It's a rare word in the Old Testament and references a person waiting with great anticipation. And so in our vernacular today, we would say the enemy of the Jews were just sitting there rubbing their hands, licking their chops. They couldn't wait. We will have new homes, new clothes, new fields, new orchards, new livestock, even before the sun sets. Verse 1 informs us, however, that they were wrong. The Jews defeated their enemies instead. Napoleon was wrong. God is on the side of his people, not whoever has the largest army or the most resources. Fighting erupts throughout the entire empire of Persia as the edict commanded, but there's no record of any Jew dying that day. However, we see, if we do the math in verses 5 through 10, a lot of Persians passed away. Let's see, the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the city itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Later on, we're given some 75,000 people later after the end of all the fighting. But just in the capital city, there's 500 people, the 10 sons of Haman. So you think, all right, well, they gained mastery. The edict was unsuccessful. Now Esther's stuff's done. Notice verse 13. Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. She goes back to the king, pleads for one more day to defend themselves. Evidently, Esther has uncovered a plot, most likely developed by Persians loyal to Haman and his 10 sons, unhappy with all these reversals and the way that 13th day went. And so they wanted to have one last chance for revenge. And so Esther says, look, will you allow us to defend ourselves one more time? And then also, will you display the bodies of Haman's sons to discourage further bloodshed? Verse 16 summarizes the fighting for us. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. You read that, 75,000 people. Sounds like a lot of people, right? That sounds like a lot. I mean, there must have been fighting everywhere. How would the nation of Persia handle like 75,000 people dying? That's a lot of people. Documents from the time period, however, tell us that at this time, Persia's population was around 50 million people. 75,000 people is indeed a lot. But compared to 50 million in the nation, 75,000's not really, that's a very small percentage of the population. How did the Persians go and the Jews go from hopelessness to only a very small percentage of the people actually taking up arms? Because of God's providence. Over and over again, we see that they couldn't stand against the Jews because the fear of the Jews had come on them. Where did that come from? It wasn't because the Jews were all 6'7" and 338 pounds of solid muscle. They weren't intimidating size-wise. It wasn't that. I mean, not all the Jews would have been effective in hand-to-hand combat. What was it? It was God's providence. That's where the fear of the Jews came from the people. They were ultimately fearing God, because they knew the stories. They had heard throughout their history of these people coming from being released from bondage in Egypt, and their God, all the things, the ways that He had provided for them in the past. God obviously turned the hearts of the Persians towards the Jewish people. If God hadn't worked, the Jews would have been destroyed without much of a fight. I can't help but think of Holland during Nazi occupation. That's one of the few countries where very few Jews, if any, died. When they would come out to have the Jewish badge on their clothes, there's one, it could be a legend, I don't know if it's true or not, but one entire town, everybody came out with that. And so the Germans realized there wasn't, so they couldn't wipe out a whole town. That show of solidarity, where does that stuff come from? Where does it come from to stand with God's people against an enemy that wants to destroy them? It comes from God. God has promised to bless His people, and God always will. And if God can remain faithful to the nation of Israel, that gives me hope that He will remain faithful to me, because I am every bit as stubborn and knuckleheaded as the Israelites are. But 3 different times in verses 10, 15, and 16, Ezra gives us the same phrase. They laid no hands on the plunder. That's significant, because there is, think of the 12 months of mental torture and anguish. They received no support from the Persians at first, especially the ones who now lie dead at their feet. Would it be stealing if they took possession of their property? Would it be unlawful? It wouldn't. We could argue whether or not it would be stealing. But it wouldn't be unlawful, because the king had already said in an edict and signed it into law that they could plunder the goods of any person who died in their attempt to kill them. This is their chance to get back. Yet we read 3 different times the Jews resist the temptation and leave their enemies' families and homes alone. They do what they need to do, and they return back to their house. Have you ever been scammed or conned? Have you ever been mistreated by a coworker or a boss, or maybe even a friend or family member? Have you ever signed a contract with someone only to find out that they lied to you? One of the most infuriating things about coming out after the Hurricane Michael is seeing people pay a contractor to do a certain job, then finding out the contractor didn't do anything that they had said that they would do. And then you're left with nothing. What would you do if you had the legal right to get that person back? What would you do? What would you do if you were offered the chance to take revenge? A guy was once bitten by a dog, rushed to the hospital. After running some tests, the doctor came into his hospital room and came in with the rather grim news that the man had rabies. The man didn't say a word in response. He just grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and began writing feverishly. His doctor was thinking the man was writing his will, and so he encouraged him, "Sir, there's a cure for rabies. You're not going to die. Everything's going to be okay." The man answered, "I know. I'm making a list of all the people I want to bite before I'm cured." Isn't that the way the world works? When I ask that question, what would we do if we had the opportunity to take revenge? Humanly speaking, we would say, I'm not going to get mad. I'm going to get even. I'm going to wait for the opportunity so they can know that I got them and I get them back worse than they got me, is bite back. It's a natural instinct to take revenge. Now, we may not use a gun, an axe, a sword, or another weapon. We may not use our fists or our feet, but maybe we use a letter or an email. But we will retaliate. It comes natural. We see someone being mistreated, a loved one. You know, there's plenty of us, especially as guys, we would say, you know what, you do anything to me and I'll be okay with it, but you mess with my wife, my daughter, or some member in my family, I'm going to get you. It comes natural when we see that. We read those stories of people being mistreated, and it's our natural human response. It's also a tool of Satan. if we engage in retaliation, if we engage in pursuing revenge ourselves, Satan knows that we will remain a victim. We're never going to get out of that cycle. Anger and bitterness will destroy our soul quicker than anything else. And anger and bitterness will destroy our soul, that not even the shedding that person's blood who wronged us, even that's not going to be enough to satiate that lust. That's why Satan never fails to come alongside us and take our human natural response while whispering, look, you've restrained yourself enough. It's okay. I mean, forget the second mile. You've gone the third and fourth mile. Now it's time to get them back. Go get them. But the Jews didn't listen. They restrained themselves from engaging in vengeful behavior. I mean, they didn't even have the New Testament to read Paul's words in Romans 12, 17 through 21. Do not repay evil for evil. Repay evil with good. You know, if you do that, you're heaping coals of fire on your person's head. They didn't have those verses. They didn't have the truth of that word. Yet, again, just imagine the scene. A group of people, especially Mordecai and Esther, and the people that were living in the capital, who decided not to go back to their homeland. We talked earlier about how there's no record of Esther and Mordecai before this edict came out. Never mentioned anything about God, their Jewish ancestry, or anything like that. Think of the way God's providence has worked in that whole situation, not only to protect His people, but to bring about a revival of character and a revival in such a way that they honor God by restraining their own natural inclination to retaliate. This morning, what has the mailman delivered to your door? Is it bad news, false accusations, unkind words, misfortune, gossip, and slander? Perhaps you're here listening this morning and you're hearing the enemy whisper in your ear, you've taken it on the chin long enough. It's time to fight back. It's time for a little revenge. Learn from these Jews. They had every reason to take revenge on their enemies. It was actually law that they could do it. I mean, how many of us would take vengeance if it would technically be unlawful to not take revenge? They refused to do anything more than simply defend themselves. Do you think that their Persian enemies took note of that change of behavior, the fact that they had restrained their desire for revenge? I can imagine that the Holy One of Israel received great honor that day. These words, Peter's words in 1 Peter 2:9, were not yet written. But I can imagine they demonstrated for us what Peter writes here in 1 Peter 2:9. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. What is so amazing about that story is not that the Jews mastered their enemies. We can look back through almost any book in the Old Testament, and you're going to see reminder after reminder of God protecting His people, the Jews not being defeated by their enemies. And even when Babylon takes the Jewish people into captivity, they're never destroyed completely. God always has a remnant, even of the northern tribe of Israel. There's still a remnant. That's part of the thing about tribulation. God's going to bring all those people back to Himself and fulfill His promises. The amazing thing about this story in the book of Esther is the fact that the Jews mastered themselves. They controlled themselves. How did they do that? I mean, just imagine if they had given in to that need for revenge, that national celebration of living to see another day. And the rest of the book talks about how festive everything was and how joyous the celebration was. It would not have been as sweet or lasted as long if they had not left vindication up to God. if they had chosen to plunder their neighbors, the celebration would not have been as joyous. And the world does not understand this principle. Think of all the books and movies that are centered around the plot of someone taking revenge. It's true that part of us being created in the image of God, we like a good story where someone is redeemed and someone overcomes odds. We like that, in part because we acknowledge that we need that saving ourselves. But the other side of that, where sin warps it, is we also like a good revenge story too, if we're honest. We want to see the person be mistreated, overcome, and get back at the bad guy. Truly turning the other cheek in our culture is clearly seen as a weakness. It's foreign to our thought. It is a mind-blowing concept. But when the world sees a Christian restrain their need for vengeance, restrain themselves, it also makes them look twice. Because God receives glory as the Spirit uses the demonstration of Christ through your life. Leave that vindication to God. God receives glory when we entrust that to Him. The book of Romans also tells us, don't take vengeance for yourself. Vengeance comes from God. He will repay. It frees us from being stuck in the cage of anger and bitterness, and also from regret about not noticing what we have around us. So how will you respond to the news on your doorstep this morning? How do we learn to restrain ourselves? How do we learn to leave vindication to God? Both those things are true. Both those things are needed. How do we do that? Simply commit to praising God and honoring God in every circumstance. When we receive that news in our mailbox, or if it comes through the letter slit in our door, will you commit to demonstrate that God is worthy of honor and praise, obedience, all the time, no matter what happens? Or, like a handful of Persians, give in to your greed and anger? That's the choice, ultimately, that Esther 8 and 9 gives us. What are we going to do when we receive that news? When that bad news arrives on our doorstep? And if we haven't received it yet, eventually it's on the way. What are we going to do? Are we going to give in to our lust for greed and anger and want to get back? Or will we commit to demonstrate that our Savior is worthy of praise and honor and trust, no matter what occurs? 1 Peter 2:9. The moment we place our faith in Christ, we acknowledge the fact that we're a sinner, we're deserving of nothing but God's judgment, and recognize the fact that Christ came, lived a sinless life, died an unjust death because He took on my sin and your sin, paid the penalty for it, rose from the dead, completely defeating sin and death. Colossians 2 tells us He made a triumph over His enemies, over our enemies. All the legal demands of our sin paid for in His life, death, and resurrection. At that moment, we became a royal priesthood, a peculiar people, a holy nation. We're set apart for God's use. It's no longer about us and what we can get back. It's about Him and what we can give Him. And so let's make it our ambition today that in every circumstance, no matter the news, we will declare the praises of Christ, who has called us out of darkness into His marvelous eternal light. Father, we're grateful for the reminder of this little historical